Today, we're going to talk about a topic that's always popular, coral reefs, particularly how climate change will affect coral reefs. Climate change will affect the world in several ways, but the one that will affect the coral reefs the most is heat, just plain old heat. Why would that be bad for corals? A process known as bleaching, which is a hot term nowadays, but what does it actually mean? To begin, we need to talk a little bit about coral anatomy. Each coral is composed of tiny animals, called polyps, distantly related to anemones and jellyfish. One coral can contain thousands of polyps, and deep within each one of them is a collection of single-celled algae known as zooxanthellae. Algae are photosynthetic. They take energy from the sun and transform it into food for both itself and for its coral host. The polyp in return provides resources and a place to live. Up to 95% of a coral's energy needs are met through this unique symbiosis of algae and animal. Zooxanthellae are also responsible for the colors in the famously vibrant coral reefs. When the zooxanthellae die, it strips the coral of its main food source and leaves it bone white. That's why scientists term this phenomenon bleaching. Corals bleach when temperatures rise. It's too hot for too long, and the algae inside just can't tolerate so much heat stress, so they die. And much of the time, they take their hosts along with them. Global bleaching events, where reefs around the world bleach, have happened 4 times already. They suffered extreme bleaching in 1998, 2002, and back-to-back events in 2016 and 2017. If you noticed, the time elapsed in between bleaching events is shrinking. Corals have less time to recover and replenish themselves before the next bleaching event. The climate is changing for the hotter. What does this mean for our world's reefs? I talked with Dr. Terry Hughes, a marine biologist with the James Cook University, nicknamed the Reef Sentinel for his global humanitarian multidisciplinary approach. He was named one of Nature Journal's top 10 scientists who matter in 2016 for his groundbreaking work with the Great Barrier Reef, the largest one in the world. His research efforts focus on the effects of large-scale bleaching events on the reef as a whole. Can you tell me how to measure the severity of coral bleaching?
There's a couple of ways to measure the severity of coral bleaching. It really depends on the scale that you're interested in. So to measure the intensity and the footprint of bleaching at the scale of the Great Barrier Reef, you have to take to the air. And that's what we did in 2016 and 2017. We chartered small airplanes and a helicopter. Bleaching is incredibly visible at its peak from a low-flying aircraft, and that's the best way to get the big picture. But if you want to measure bleaching in more detail, you have to go underwater, and there you can get more precise information. You can identify which corals are bleaching the most, and you can go back again and see how well they've survived after the bleaching.
Yeah, can you give us an idea of the scale of the bleaching events that happen in the Great Barrier Reef?
Well, the Great Barrier Reef has now bleached 4 times. The first time was in 1998, the second in 2002, and then tragically we saw back-to-back bleaching for the first time in 2016 and 2017. So 2 of those events were during El Niño events when the temperatures were above average, but the other 2 were not during El Niños. They were just during very hot summers, record-breaking hot summers. So we're seeing more and more of these bleaching events, and we're concerned that the gap between them, between one event and the next, is shrinking. And that gap is important because that's the window of opportunity for the corals to recover afterwards.
Yes, of course. Is there any difference between the corals that died during these bleaching events and the ones that survived?
Bleaching is actually incredibly selective. So we talk about species of corals that are relative winners versus losers. So the winners are the tougher corals that are thermally more tolerant. It takes more heat to make them bleach and more heat to kill them, whereas the losers are much more susceptible. The species that are losers tend to be branching corals, or corals that are the shape of and size of a coffee table. And those are very important for the broader ecology of the reef because they provide most of the nooks and crannies, the habitat that supports fish and all the rest of the biodiversity associated with a healthy coral reef. So globally, we're seeing a loss of these so-called loser species. Reefs are becoming flatter as a consequence because the winners tend to be dome-shaped or flat corals that are encrusting like a giant cornflake on the substrate. They're not as good as making habitat as the more three-dimensional species. Mm-hmm. So losing corals is important, not just because we're losing the corals themselves, but because of the value of corals to the whole ecosystem.
But bleaching doesn't necessarily kill the corals. It kills the zooxanthellae that live inside them, right?
It disrupts the symbiosis between the coral and the microscopic algae, the zooxanthellae that live inside the coral tissue. Even a coral that's snow white, that's fully bleached, still has a small residual population of algae inside its tissues. So two things can happen after a bleaching event, which is triggered by thermal stress, by extreme temperatures. The coral can either regain its population of algae and become colorful again, because most of the color that a coral has is from its microscopic algae, or the coral can die. And we were shocked and surprised that about 25% of the corals that bleached on the Great Barrier Reef in 2016 died within a week of being exposed to very high temperatures. So the conventional thinking around bleaching mortality after bleaching is that the corals die slowly of starvation because they don't have the zooxanthellae inside the tissues providing them with energy from photosynthesis. But that's not what we found. We found that the temperatures were so high that the corals were killed directly by exposure to hot water.
So they didn't die from starvation from that loss of food source. They directly died from the heat.
That's right. About half of them died very quickly from the heat. The mortality is actually quite complicated in the months after bleaching. We saw more coral disease than we'd ever seen before. So the corals were weakened by the exposure to hot temperatures, which made them more susceptible to disease. And because there were fewer corals surviving, and because their predators survived very well, the amount of predation on the surviving corals increased. So we saw more corals being eaten by snails and starfish that weren't as badly affected by the heat.
Corals that survived the 2016 bleaching event had a much better chance of survival during the 2017 event. Can you explain this concept of ecological memory?
Ecological memory is basically how the past can influence the present behavior or dynamics of a population. So 2016 and 2017 were the first time we saw back-to-back bleaching in 2 consecutive summer. So it gave us the opportunity to ask the question whether the experience the corals had in 2016 in year 1 affected their response to another blast of heat a year later in 2017. And to our surprise, we found that in the second year it took a lot more heat to produce the same level of bleaching. And there are a couple of different reasons why we found that result. The main one, of course, is that dead corals can't bleach again. So the first event removed many of the heat-susceptible species, the so-called losers, primarily branching corals. So when the heat returned a year later, most of the population was the winner species that had survived the bleaching 1 year earlier, and they're a lot tougher. And that finding is important because it tells us that future bleaching events in coming years and decades are likely to have a different effect on the populations of corals than they do today. We're already seeing a very rapid shift in the mix of species that make up a coral reef assemblage, and they're getting tougher with more and more of these bleaching events occurring. So that's potentially a source of resilience and a source of hope for the future of these reefs. I'm often asked the question whether or not we will have reefs in 30 to 50 years. And my answer is reasonably optimistic. I think we will if we can reach close to the 1.5 degrees centigrade of global average warming under the terms of the Paris Agreement. If we can reach that target, then I do think we will have coral reefs in the future. But the mix of species will be different from today. It's already different today from just 3 years ago on the Great Barrier Reef. So this change in the mix of species is already happening much quicker than we had anticipated.
Do you think those more heat-tolerant corals could have evolved to be even more heat-tolerant as time goes on?
Well, we now have a glass half full scenario on the Great Barrier Reef. 50% of the corals died in the summers of 2016 and 2017. That means there's still about 1 billion of them alive out there, and they are breeding and reproducing. So we've seen a change in the mix of species. There's almost certainly also been a change in the genetic composition of the survivors compared to before the bleaching. So that's a big research area for the future, to look at how these species are changing and evolving.
Yeah, what is the trajectory for the overall health of the reef in the next 30 to 50 years?
Well, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. So we've now seen 4 bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef since 1998. We will almost certainly see a 5th and a 6th one within the next decade. It takes at least 10 years for a decent recovery after a mass die-off of corals. So the interval between these recurrent bleaching events is shrinking. So the opportunity for recovery is being curtailed. What the corals really need is for rising temperatures to stabilize, and that will occur in the future. The big question mark is, what will it stabilize at? And that's completely contingent on future greenhouse gas emissions. The sooner the planet reduces greenhouse gas emissions to net zero, the better. If we can reach 1.5 degrees of global average warming, then we will still have vibrant, healthy coral reefs in the future, but they will be different from the reefs of today.
On a global scale, have coral reefs fundamentally changed?
They have, and unfortunately, the normal change around most of the planet is for a loss of biodiversity, for a reduction in the amount of cover by corals, which is the normal way that people measure how much coral there is. We talk about the percent cover being 50 or 60%, which is at the higher end of the range, but many reefs now are closer to 10% cover. And that's unfortunately the trajectory that the Great Barrier Reef is following. The amount of coral cover there today is the lowest we've ever measured since that monitoring began in the 1980s.
So many people depend on coral reefs for their livelihood, about 400 million. What kind of services and resources does the reef provide?
The reef provides a broad range of so-called goods and services to coastal societies, primarily in small, relatively poor and often rapidly developing countries. So fisheries from reefs is a huge issue. It provides food security for many, many people. Reefs are also important for a global coral reef tourism industry, which is often the mainstay of small island economies. So losing coral reefs is not just an issue that's relevant to how people feel about the beauty of a reef, its aesthetics, or maybe how they feel about endangered species like turtles or manatees. It's the bread and butter for 400 million people around the world.
So how can we protect their economic security as the reef is declining?
Well, the number one issue affecting reefs around the world today is climate change, particularly global warming. Rising temperatures are causing bleaching, which is killing many corals. That is the number one. There are other ongoing issues that are more local and which can be managed more locally, particularly overfishing and local pollution. Usually that pollution is in the form of runoff from land, of sediment and nutrients in rivers. But even if we looked after water quality, pollution, and overfishing, we'd still have the elephant in the room to deal with, and that's global warming. There's nowhere to hide from global warming, so even the most pristine and even the most best managed reefs around the world are still being impacted by global warming. There's no time to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
In management and conservation, as the reefs are declining, as we're having global warming and temperatures are rising, what would be the objective for a conservationist? What is the goal to work towards?
Well, conservationists generally want to maintain, preserve, or sometimes restore coral reefs the way they used to be. And it's actually quite confronting now to get your head around the fact that that's no longer possible. We basically are studying coral reefs that are on a trajectory, and they can go in several different directions depending on how we manage the pressures that are affecting them, the number one pressure being global warming. If we do nothing about global warming, then coral reefs will end up in a very bad place. There's no time to lose to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
What would be the ideal management policy for that?
Well, current management policies are generally focused on local issues. Management agencies generally have a boundary within which they work. So the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority is responsible for things that go on inside the boundaries of that very large marine park. They have no authority to deal with global warming or Australia's or anyone else's carbon emissions. And that's the problem. We have a crisis of governance that needs to be addressed. We now have a framework for dealing with global warming, the Paris Agreement. So the future solutions of the reef will revolve around improving governance. That's governance of global warming, governance of fisheries, and governance of pollution. And often today, those different issues are under the control of different agencies. So we need to redesign how governance is integrated across multiple agencies, across multiple countries. And we need a lot more insights from the social sciences, not just the biological sciences, into the dynamics of reefs and how people interact with them.
So where do we start? What can the average person here in California do?
Well, I think a critical thing that everyone can do is vote for politicians and governments who will take action on the threats to reef, particularly the threat of global warming. And certainly in most countries, there's a disparity between different political parties in their policies towards global warming and greenhouse gas emissions. The current government of Australia, for instance, at the federal level, is very much pro-fossil fuels. They've just recently issued a permit for a very large new coal mine. And many people in Australia are upset about that because it's really anathema to better governance of the Great Barrier Reef. Professor Terry Hughes, director of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies in Townsville, Australia,